saw him out there. So baseball hat really low, and he was kind of hunched over, and he was kind of looking around, and he just didn't fit. And he wasn't going terribly quickly like a normal person.
At 4 a.m, a digital eye in the neighborhood caught a glimpse of something the Bureau had missed until now. It was January 24th, exactly 1 week before the abduction. A solitary figure drifted through the streets with no clear destination. There was no mundane explanation for his presence at such an hour. He was a phantom in a place where everyone else slept. He leaned into glass panes and grasped at hardware, checking for the fatal mistake of an unlocked door. This wasn't a casual stroll. It was a systematic audit of the street's security, performed with a startling lack of concealment. He wore no disguise, no shroud, no lenses, nothing to obstruct the high-definition sensors watching his every move. Because his bare hands gripped those latches, he left behind a trail of biological evidence, just waiting for a forensic kit. This wasn't a routine sweep by federal agents. They arrived with a laser focus on that specific 24-hour window. They moved from house to house, inquiring specifically about the events of January 24th by name. This implies a prior knowledge of that date's significance, a detail that has left observers of this mystery deeply unsettled. This individual, whose features were recorded so clearly in the pre-dawn light, does not match the figure seen later on that porch. We are looking at two distinct shadows and different psychological profiles. So, if the Bureau possesses his likeness and his digital signature is etched onto those doors, why does his identity remain a mystery? Why does he remain a shadow? And what does the FBI's early interest suggest about the true depth of their current lead? Before we proceed, understand that this breakdown relies on documented reports from credentialed journalists and established news agencies. These observations serve as a logical framework built on verified data, not as a formal accusation against any specific person. The hunt for Nancy remains an active federal priority. Her family's need for the truth is the sole driver of our inquiry. We must separate fact from the surrounding static, as the minutiae of this timeline are where the truth is hidden. On March 16th, a prominent investigative reporter, known for his meticulous and accurate coverage of this disappearance, broke a story that sent a chill through the entire true crime community. Federal agents were revisiting neighbors, not seeking footage of the abduction on February 1st, but looking for something much earlier. They were focused on January 24th, treating it as a pivotal moment in their timeline. This was a Saturday, a mere 8 days before Nancy stepped out of her home in Plainfield, Indiana, and vanished, just 8 days prior. For those tracking the case, the implications of this specific timing are profound. A targeted request for a specific date suggests a breakthrough in intelligence, far beyond a standard canvas of the scene. They already have the abduction footage. Returning for records from 3 weeks prior indicates a specific trail they are now following. This is a deliberate, intelligence-driven operation. The Bureau's actions indicate they believe something on January 24th served as a catalyst for the tragedy that followed. Reports have surfaced from local security networks where residents share alerts, and the details emerging are deeply unsettling. The descriptions shared in those digital communities paint a chilling picture of what was happening in the dark. A man was observed in the early hours of that Saturday, haunting the periphery of homes and testing the locks. He wasn't just passing by. He was probing multiple residences, searching for a point of vulnerability on that very street. One particular detail has become the primary focus of both investigators and those analyzing the case. This prowler took no precautions to hide his identity. No gloves were worn, and no mask shielded his face from lenses. His appearance was captured with high-definition clarity. By touching those handles with his bare skin, he likely left a wealth of forensic data behind a haunting thought. Contrast this with the person who actually took Nancy on February 1st. That figure was shrouded, gloved, and cautious. The kidnapper displayed a sophisticated understanding of how to evade modern surveillance techniques. That individual treated the cameras as a threat to be managed, actively minimizing any identifying traits. The behavioral signature of the porch figure suggests a predator who calculates his risks and understands the mechanics of an arrest. The individual captured on January 24th seems to inhabit an entirely separate psychological reality. This stark divergence in conduct led the investigative panel to determine that we are almost certainly looking at two distinct individuals. Who exactly is this phantom from the 24th? The inquiry shifts here, as the lens through which we view this figure fundamentally alters the gravity of the entire case. 3 primary hypotheses demand our focused scrutiny. This isn't mere conjecture. The Bureau's cryptic handling of this person hints at a hidden agenda. Hypothesis 1. The isolated predator. This possibility was seriously weighed during the initial debrief, meriting attention because it stems from a place of calculated observation rather than wild guessing. The analysis highlights a chilling reality that suburbanites often ignore. Shadows move where we feel safest. Figures drift through the darkness, testing latches and peering through glass, while the world sleeps in blissful ignorance. Crucially, this man's lack of concealment suggests a different motive. In this scenario, he is a criminal element, certainly, but not the one responsible for this specific tragedy. His presence near the residence weeks prior would be a dark coincidence rather than a coordinated strike. Federal agents likely flagged this footage during a routine sweep of local anomalies. They may have already dismissed him, yet the simplicity of this theory is its greatest strength. It strips away the need for a complex web of actors. It explains the behavioral shift without requiring a conspiracy, yet a haunting void remains. If this man is truly a ghost in the machine, why has the Bureau maintained such an airtight silence? In a case fueled by intense public scrutiny, providing closure on a lead usually serves the investigation. The absence of a public clearance suggests he is more than just a random nightcrawler. Hypothesis 2. The advanced scout. This perspective holds the most weight among those applying a cold, surgical logic to the evidence. Here, the man isn't being sloppy. He is performing a specialized, compartmentalized role. Premeditated crimes often require a casing phase, a systematic gathering of environmental intelligence. One must map the terrain, the schedules, and the invisible vulnerabilities of the target's life. Often, the one who maps the architecture of the crime is never the one who executes the final act. High-level operations rely on this separation of labor to insulate the primary offender. While the scout collects data, the operator remains in the shadows, emerging only when the risk is absolute. Under this lens, the figure on January 24th was indifferent to cameras because he was merely an information harvester. He was there to feel for the weak points, the unlocked door, or the blind spot, identifying motion sensors, noting the presence of guard dogs, or timing the movement of vehicles in the driveway. He was sketching a blueprint of the victim's world for someone else to use. Exposure wasn't his primary concern, unlike the predator who would eventually step onto that porch. If this theory holds, we are not hunting a lone wolf, and we never were. There are at least two individuals who hold the key to what happened to the victim. Two shadows crossed that neighborhood in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, and finding their link is the ultimate priority. Hypothesis 3. The tangential associate. This middle ground suggests the man is connected to the kidnapping, though perhaps not as a professional surveyor. He exists within the social orbit of the mastermind, a person drawn to the area by proximity or shared intent, acting as a bridge between the plan and the place. He was aware of the brewing storm. He likely played a minor role, feeling safe in his anonymity because he didn't expect to become a focal point. While analytically elusive, this reflects the messy reality of criminal networks. They aren't always sleek machines, but rather loose webs where information leaks between the reckless and the calculated. The dilemma of the exposed face. There is an inherent chilling quality to this footage that defies any simple explanation, regardless of your personal theory. When federal agents began canvassing neighbors for recordings from January 24th, it was anything but a random inquiry. In a federal probe of this magnitude, fueled by a specialized task force, intense national scrutiny, and total resource mobilization, investigators do not fixate on a specific date without actionable intelligence. Long before the first door was knocked on, authorities were convinced that January 24th held significance. They likely possessed this footage before the formal request. This raises a haunting question. Why is this man's face visible if the Bureau holds usable imagery from that day? He moves with the deceptive leisure of a jogger. Yet, as he passes this street, his gaze lingers unsettlingly. Given the prevalence of modern residential surveillance networks, the Bureau utilizes sophisticated analytical tools that far surpass the reach of any private citizen. The next-generation identification system houses a staggering 150 million facial records, encompassing state IDs, passports, booking photos, and military archives, even before tapping into international criminal databases. If this individual has ever existed on paper, held a government ID, or had a fleeting brush with the law, a clear ring camera shot makes him identifiable. This is where the tactical silence becomes truly deafening. Standard protocol dictates that police only solicit public help, the "do you know this man" alert, when internal efforts fail. The urgent plea for tips only occurs when the massive digital databases return a void and internal leads are exhausted. Yet, for the figure seen on January 24th, no such public appeal exists. No official flyer, no identifying post. That absence of noise is a crucial piece of evidence. That silence is a calculated data point. Two grim realities exist. Either they have identified him and are monitoring him covertly to avoid spooking a network, preventing a sudden change in behavior, or protecting a sensitive, ongoing surveillance operation, or they are holding back to keep Nancy safe. Or he vanished after every database check, implying this man exists entirely off the grid, a phantom outside the reach of bureaucracy, which is far more terrifying. Both scenarios lead to a dark conclusion. Neither suggests he is an innocent bystander. A naive explanation suggests they simply haven't checked yet. But that is not how federal kidnapping task forces function. They have checked. The real mystery lies in what they found. Now, consider the dates. Why January 11th and January 24th? This wasn't a search for a single moment. It was for a pattern. This detail transforms a suspicious encounter into something far more clinical. A systematic, pre-operational timeline. According to investigative reports from NewsNation and ABC, federal agents targeted two very specific windows of time in their neighborhood canvas: Saturday, January 11th, between 9 p.m. and midnight, and Saturday, January 24th. Two distinct Saturdays, meticulously selected. While January 11th had been previously noted by local residents, the addition of the following Saturday is no coincidence. It is a deliberate tactical marker. Saturdays hold a specific psychological weight in pre-operational surveillance, for reasons that are often overlooked. The social landscape of a suburban neighborhood shifts on the weekend, altering the baseline of normal behavior. Weekdays follow a rigid structure of commutes. On Saturdays, that clock stops, and the rhythm becomes erratic. Mornings start later, the usual routines are abandoned, and crucially, a stranger is harder to spot because the mental map of who belongs there is blurred. Furthermore, observing a target on a Saturday provides specific insight into their leisure habits and vulnerabilities, which is vital if the planned operation is intended for a specific weekend morning. 13 days pass between January 11th and 24th. Then, 8 days later, Nancy is taken on February 1st. Observe the accelerating cadence. 13 days between sightings, then a final 8-day countdown to the abduction. If an intruder was conducting multiple site visits to map a life, that tightening interval is a closing trap. A 14-day window allows a predator to map out a victim's habits without drawing local attention or appearing like a suspicious, permanent fixture. A thick shroud of secrecy still hangs over the 3-hour gap between 9 p.m. and midnight on January 11th. Federal investigators have maintained a cold silence regarding the specific events they believe unfolded during those dark hours. The significance is clear because they specifically sought recordings from that time frame. A pinpoint request for footage 21 days prior to a kidnapping is never a random act. Something surfaced within that narrow window, a detail the Bureau is convinced bridges the gap to Nancy's disappearance. Looking back through the lens of the January 24th evidence, the blurry outlines of those earlier events are finally starting to take a chilling shape. Examine the calculated rhythm of this timeline. 3 distinct points of contact stretched across 21 days of patient observation. This was no sudden burst of violence or a crime born of passing opportunity. It was a slow, methodical haunting. A shadow was present, returning to this quiet residential street multiple times, with the sole purpose of tracking a specific woman's every move. One final visit under the cover of darkness, and by sunrise, she had vanished. The word targeted echoes through this investigation with haunting persistence. It is a deeply unsettling realization. The perpetrator had ample time to watch, to plan, and to walk away. Yet they chose to move forward. We are witnessing a fundamental fracture in behavioral patterns. The lead analyst stated the facts plainly, and her assessment is worth revisiting because her professional insight carries immense weight. The man seen on January 24th isn't bothering to hide his identity. He is effectively hiding in plain sight. This conclusion from a dedicated team of experts points toward a threat model that is psychologically distinct from what we typically expect. Placing these two psychological profiles side by side reveals a jarring contrast that dictates every move of the subsequent investigation. Consider the figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch on the morning of February 1st. hands shielded by gloves. Their face is carefully turned or masked with deliberate intent, while their approach to the residence is slow and chillingly precise. This individual possesses a sophisticated understanding of modern security, knowing exactly where the lenses are and how the clocks are ticking. They are acutely aware that every frame can become evidence in a courtroom, exhibiting an advanced level of operational security against surveillance. Every movement was a calculated effort to leave behind a ghost, minimizing any possible forensic trail. Contrast this with the January 24th figure, wandering the neighborhood at 4 a.m. with zero attempt at concealment. They lean in close, pressing their features against the glass of windows in a display of startling recklessness. By doing so, they place their most identifiable traits directly in front of potential lenses, seemingly indifferent to the risk. They reach for latches and handles with bare hands, discarding biological clues and friction ridges across every surface they encounter. No pulled-up collar, no shielding of the eyes. They move through the environment as if the concept of being watched simply doesn't exist. These aren't merely two different moods of the same person. They represent two entirely separate ways of functioning. We are looking at two categorically different tactical signatures. A person who meticulously hides from a porch camera does not suddenly transform into someone who smears their bare face against a window at 4 a.m. The perception of risk is different, the awareness of detection is different, and the very foundation of their threat model is fundamentally altered. The evidence suggests these are two unique individuals, a behavioral discrepancy that the investigative panel correctly identified. This isn't a question of physical build or hair color factors easily manipulated by a simple disguise or obscured by low-resolution lenses. It is a question of psychological intent, how a person behaves when they believe they are invisible versus when they know they are being watched. For the porch figure, evading the camera is the central mission of the moment. For the January 24th figure, the camera might as well not exist, and that is where the mystery deepens. To be fair, a mismatch in behavior between two suspects doesn't automatically link them to the same crime. It is entirely possible for two unrelated predators with different methods to haunt the same geographic coordinates. While the lone prowler theory might explain the presence, it fails to account for the precise, chilling timing of these events. It ignores the FBI's intense focus on January 24th and the rhythmic pattern of Saturday visits leading up to the abduction. When you overlay the psychological data onto the physical timeline, the theory of a coordinated effort becomes far more plausible than simple coincidence. Examining the mechanics of the scout theory in granular detail, suggesting a scout was involved isn't a leap of imagination or a wild conspiracy. It is a recognized tactical reality. This is a documented operational framework, often seen in high-stakes crimes that demand deep reconnaissance and logistical intelligence. Understanding this structure explains why the behavioral gap between the January 24th figure and the primary suspect isn't a flaw in the theory. In fact, that very discrepancy is exactly what one would expect from a coordinated, two-man operation. Crimes requiring specialized insight into a mark's life rarely involve just one individual. Their coordinates, daily habits, and inherent weaknesses are meticulously mapped out. In complex plots, the reconnaissance phase is severed from the physical act to ensure a layer of deniability. Separating these functions provides a firewall for the perpetrators. Should the entity conducting the initial surveillance sweep be identified, that exposure rarely compromises the actual killer. Conversely, if the primary assailant falls into custody, tying them back to the preliminary scouting requires a second, distinct link in the evidentiary chain. Under this strategic architecture, the figure seen on January 24th functioned as a surveyor, not an operative. They weren't there for Nancy yet. They were acquiring intelligence. They cataloged which residences housed vocal dogs and which driveways signaled an active household. They identified the most porous entry points on the target's perimeter. They mapped surveillance angles, hunting for blind spots and corridors offering the most cover from public view. Such granular detail cannot be gleaned remotely. It requires boots on the ground. Crucially, for a scout, remaining invisible isn't the priority it would be for the person caught in the act of a felony. Appearing on a doorbell camera while assessing a neighborhood is an inconvenient complication, but it lacks the devastating legal weight of being captured during the actual kidnapping. This is a calculated hierarchy of risk management, explaining why the January 24th figure appeared so indifferent to the myriad lenses watching them. The scout hypothesis carries a chilling implication regarding Nancy's fate that matters enormously for the investigation. If a secondary operative was indeed deployed for pre-operational recon, then the architect of this disappearance possessed logistics and a structural depth far beyond a lone wolf. It suggests Nancy Guthrie was a chosen target. Her lifestyle, her patterns, and her window of vulnerability were known. This level of surgical precision transforms the very nature of the search for her. The case shifts from a random act of violence to a targeted operation driven by a specific, calculated motive. We must ask, who stood to gain from Nancy Guthrie's vanishing? Who harbored a reason to want her gone? And who held the capacity to execute at this level? These are the questions currently haunting federal agents, with that January footage serving as a vital thread. The broader pattern of the neighborhood has been largely ignored in favor of chasing individual profiles. Yet, the digital paper trail left on community boards reveals more than just a single face. It exposes the strategic environment the Bureau is navigating and the wealth of data the residents may unknowingly possess. These neighborhood networks are not merely fringe platforms. They act as a sophisticated, grid-wide alert system woven into the very fabric of local security hardware. A report of suspicious behavior instantly broadcasts to every connected household within a specific geographic radius. This triggers a collective reflex. Neighbors watch, react, and scrutinize their own recorded histories. More importantly, these interactions create a decentralized archive of proof that survives even if the police aren't notified. Reports from 4 a.m. on January 24th detailed a figure lurking at windows and testing door locks. If those alerts sparked a digital conversation among the residents, if they compared sightings and shared additional time-stamped clips, then investigators arrived to find a community that had already begun the process of forensic documentation. This is the power of a synchronized network over a solitary lens. By stitching together feeds from a whole block, authorities can trace a suspect's precise trajectory through the shadows. They can determine the point of origin, the path of travel, and the ultimate exit. Did they arrive by foot? From which alleyway? Is there a vehicle tucked away, or a street camera they passed? This multi-point reconstruction is a far more lethal investigative tool than a fragmented video clip. It is a tactical blueprint. In this world, a map is the ultimate form of intelligence. To those in the vicinity with active cameras on January 24th, 2025, your data remains a critical piece of this puzzle. That appeal remains active. The images stored on your device could be a vital piece of the mosaic federal agents are currently assembling. Contact the tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or visit tips.fbi.gov. If you recorded anything from that particular evening, please come forward with those materials. The heavy silence surrounding this case requires a name, as this specific tactical pattern often escapes direct public scrutiny. Investigative reports regarding the events of January 24th surfaced in mid-March, roughly 6 weeks after the victim vanished. 42 days passed between the occurrence and the disclosure. That this detail emerged via independent reporting, not a formal briefing, nor through any sanctioned update, but through private security feeds and rigorous journalism reveals a very deliberate strategy regarding the management of information. In an active manhunt, authorities treat data as a weapon, releasing it with surgical precision through very specific channels. These are calculated maneuvers. The Bureau held no media briefing to announce their focus on January 24th. Instead, agents moved like ghosts, knocking on specific doors to request very narrow windows of time. This operation only became known because neighbors share notes and digital forums buzz with activity. Diligent investigators were watching closely enough to notice. That subtle sweep reveals two critical things. First, they likely didn't want to alert their targets that the date of January 24th had been flagged. Broadcasting that interest warns the guilty. Moving in the shadows keeps the investigation secure. Second, it suggests they possessed intelligence regarding that date before they ever set foot on those porches. They needed an evidentiary trail built from scratch to verify a lead without exposing a sensitive source. Neither of these scenarios allows for speed or immediate answers. Neither offers the sudden gratification of an arrest that this community so desperately craves. They describe an operation that is still in its intake phase rather than approaching a public climax. To the observer, a gathering phase looks like a vacuum, but in a federal kidnapping case, that vacuum is heavy with intent. When you understand the machinery, silence isn't an absence, it is the sound of a trap being set in the dark. Let us revisit the core evidence from the beginning. A doorbell camera filmed a man at 4 in the morning on January 24th, 8 days before the abduction. His face was exposed. He left physical traces on door handles throughout the street. The Bureau requested this footage by its exact date. Based on expert forensic review of the footage, this subject is likely distinct from the individual seen on February 1st, suggesting agents are hunting a pair. If one suspect left his likeness and prints across a residential block on a date the FBI was already tracking, then the Bureau has already processed those digital files. They have utilized facial recognition and cataloged every forensic marker left at the scene. They have executed the full procedural weight that a federal agency brings to high-definition evidence. The mystery we are currently inhabiting is what happened when those systems returned a specific result. Only two paths exist. Either they identified the subject and are tracking him through a covert operation because transparency would shatter the case or alert a wider criminal network to their progress, sabotaging a potential rescue effort, or putting the victim in even greater peril. Or they searched every database and found a phantom, a man who has managed to exist entirely outside the digital and forensic grids the Bureau maintains. That suggests a much more sophisticated threat. Neither path tells us her location, but one confirms the Bureau knows more. For a 57-year-old grandmother and matriarch, a beloved neighbor whose absence has been felt by her community since February 1st, an exposed man scouting her street 8 days prior, leaving fingerprints behind, remains a ghost in the official record. That specific omission is a piece of evidence in itself. It demands scrutiny and a resolution. Given the clarity of his face and forensic traces, the Bureau already possesses his name.